Hello everybody, this is TipTopMTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are taking a look at Innistrad Midnight Hunt and the top 10 most expensive cards. So essentially, I'm going to go through this list of cards in the main set and kind of talk about what is the most expensive, why I think that's the case, just kind of talk about it in general. But before we do that, I do have to say a couple caveats. First off, this is pre-order, so essentially these are going to be the prices before the set has even released, meaning if you check this in the future, prices are likely to be different, most likely in the downward direction. On top of that, these prices are in USD and from Card Kingdom, meaning you can probably find them for cheaper on other sources. I just like to have one consistent kind of platform that's selling it across all of them. That way, even if the prices are higher, they're all consistently higher, so a comparison of them is pretty accurate. So keep those things in mind when we're talking about this list. This is also typically where you will see the quote-unquote most powerful cards from the set, as typically the cards that are the most powerful are the ones people are going to talk about, which therefore are the ones that are going to get expensive. Either way, we're going to talk about those top 10, and then I have a couple other, I don't want to say goodies, but things we're going to talk about at the end. Either way, let's just jump into this by talking about number 10, Augur of Autumn. It's 1 green for a creature human druid 2/3. And it says, you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands from the top of your library. As long as you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library. And that's going for about $10 right now. So this is a pretty awesome card. I mean, if we look at some other cards like Oracle of Moldiah, which lets you look at the top card of your library and play lands from it, yes, that one gives you an extra land drop each turn, which is pretty powerful. But this one pretty easily can be converted into one that lets you play lands and creatures off the top of your library, which in a lot of decks just turns this into you may play the top card of your library. And so that ends up being really, really good. And even if you don't, you get some filtering. You can make sure that you're only drawing your relevant cards. And so I feel like this is just one of those really powerhouse cards that is going to do well in a lot of different places. But I think it's especially going to see play in Brawl, Historic Brawl, and Commander, where that value that it's generating is a little bit better because, in something like Historic or Standard, you are getting that value from it. And I'm not trying to say it's bad in any way, and this could definitely fit in a deck, but you're going to get more value out of it over the long run in a Commander game where people are doing more and your games typically go longer. Either way, let's talk about number 9. Number 9 is Unnatural Growth. It's 1 green. So that is 5 mana, 4 of which has to be green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. And this is going for $12. So this one is, again, a pretty good card. And, the other one I compared to Oracle of Moldiah, which is a very powerful, very popular card in things like Commander. This one I'm going to compare to Xenagos, which is a god from the original Theros that just doubles one of your creatures' power and toughness and gives them trample. So this doesn't give your creatures trample, but it does double all of their power and toughness, not just one thing. I believe Xenagos also gave haste, and so there are a couple differences there, but this is going to double everything. I mean, there are a ton of decks that are going to want this. If you have a couple creatures you're trying to get big, this is going to go good in that because you're going to double those to be even bigger. If you have a ton of small little creatures, even if you have 5/1/1s, this thing turns them into 5/2/2s, which is a pretty considerably bigger amount of damage. And so I think that this is pretty awesome. It's also each combat, not just your combat. So if people try to swing into you, you are doubling the power and toughness of your creatures. And so essentially they're just not big outside of combat, which can be relevant for some abilities. But just this basically says if you're in combat, for all purposes of combat, you're doubling power and toughness. And it is relevant that it's not just always doubled. For instance, if you had a damage spell that did 2 damage to something, I could cast it before combat and then, it wouldn't get doubled toughness. But this just seems really good when you compare it to things like Xenagos, where it's going to fill a lot of that same slot. And it's just going to do it to all your creatures all the time. And so I think that's going to be really, really awesome in those style of decks that want to get big damage in. Next, we have Spectral Adversary, our first mythic. It's going for about $12, but it's a 2-cost blue creature spirit 2/1 with flying and flash, so you can flash this in. And it says, when it enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 and a blue any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many +1/+1 counters on Spectral Adversary, then up to that many other target artifacts, creatures, and or enchantments phase out. So, some cool things about this. At its worst, this is a 2-cost 2/1 flying with flash. Flying, flasher, whatever. Flashing flyer. whatever you want to call it. That's not bad. Then you pay 4 mana. Now you have a 3/2 flying with flash for 4 mana that also phases something out. Now that can be one of your own creatures to save it from a removal spell. It can be an opponent's creature so that you don't get hit by it. It could be something that's giving your opponent's creatures a persistent effect and you phase it out and then boom, now all their creatures are smaller. Now you get a bloodbath because they weren't expecting it. And so it's Blue's way of basically being able to deal with artifacts, enchantments, and creatures all while also getting creature value out of it. And then if you do have more mana, you can go and say, oh, you attacked me with 6 creatures, let's phase 3 of them out. Now I have this huge blocker and then block that, and it's all done at instant speed. So you can do a lot of really tricky stuff with this. I feel like it's going to be better in those 1v1 formats where tempo is a lot bigger of a deal. In those multiplayer formats, it's not as huge of a deal. Unless you can turn it into some bloodbath, but that's not going to happen as often. Versus in a 1v1, if you can get rid of one of your opponent's things for just a turn even, it can be very, very awesome. Spirits is also kind of a thing in Historic, so it'll be interesting to see if this makes any waves there. Which, by the way, Historic doesn't impact card prices at all. I just like to mention it because typically this is a list of the most powerful cards. Either way, let's speed this up a little bit. We have Tovolar, Dire Overlord. He's a $13 card. It's a 1 red and a green for a legendary creature, human werewolf, 3/3. Whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So just, for each wolf that's dealing damage, draw a card. Very good effect. If you want to build a commander, like if I'm designing a commander for a mechanic, when you do mechanic, draw card is always going to be good. And so this is just doing that. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more wolves and or werewolves, it becomes night. Then transform any number of human werewolves you control. So essentially what this is saying is, on your turn, it's always night. You don't have to worry about what your opponents are doing. Your werewolves are always transformed. And once Tovolar becomes transformed, he becomes Tovolar, the Midnight Scourge. It's a 4/4 legendary creature werewolf. Whenever a wolf or werewolf you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So we have that same exact effect. Again, very good. And then X green and a red, target wolf or werewolf you control gets +X/+O and gains night or trample until end of turn. All right. Very awesome. Essentially, you don't have to care about day-night except when it comes to blocking. And I don't even... Wait, let's go back to this one. It's actually... Yeah, it's just at your upkeep. That's exactly what I thought it was. So during your opponent's turn, you have to worry about day and night in terms of blocking, but you will basically always be attacking with transformed werewolves as long as you control 3, which is probably going to be happening. I think a big reason this is so high on the list is it's the first werewolf commander, and honestly one of the only werewolf commanders in the set, and it's one that you can use even with your old werewolves. They designed it with that in mind. It doesn't just say it becomes night, they said it becomes night and you transform all your werewolves, which is just really good value that can work with the old cards as well as with all the new ones. Next, we have Liere, Disciple of the Drowned. It's 3 blue for a legendary creature, human wizard, 3/4 with spells that can't be countered. So that includes your spells and your opponent. So you can't counterspell your stuff, which if you're in a mono blue deck doesn't feel great. But each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard has flashback. The flashback cost is equal to that card's mana cost. So essentially you get to cast your spells twice. Now the reason that first part is on there, they don't want you double casting counter spells because that is just kind of insane, especially because you're flashbacking them for their original cost. If you played Opt, you pay blue to Opt, and then it goes in your graveyard, and then you pay blue to Opt again. It's not like Jumpstart or something where you have to also discard a card, or, there's some other cost associated with it, or like exiling cards from your graveyard. You literally just get to cast the spells again. So, very good. I think this will be a commander, I don't want to say stable, but a very, very good commander, just because you are generating so much value. You draw a card, you're essentially drawing 2. And I just don't think you can really compete with that. So I think this is going to be one of those really good commanders that is going to have some interesting ways of maybe countering stuff. Or maybe not countering stuff, but controlling the board. Because typically that's how blue does it, is through countering stuff. But you may have to have more bouncing spells back to hand, redirecting targets, stuff like that. That technically isn't countering, but does similar things. And I think that kind of commander deck can be really, really good. Next, we have the Meathook Massacre. It's X black for a legendary enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, each creature gets -X until end of turn. So you can make it be anywhere from 0 to 1,000,000, and you can kind of selectively board wipe. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and whenever a creature an opponent controlled dies, you gain 1 life. So essentially what this is saying here is that you can kill people Very easily with this. Anytime a creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life. Great. Essentially, any sacrifice outlet now can just ping people to death. And obviously, we already have cards like this, but Bastion of Remembrance is one of the few things we have left in Standard, and this is looking to replace it. Bastion of Remembrance was an enchantment that created a 1/1 when it entered the battlefield, and then whenever a creature you controlled died, each opponent lost life and you gained one. This is very similar, but the difference is this thing comes with a board wipe. And if you don't want to board wipe, you can play this for just black and get this effect. Now, of course, it is legendary, which does change the dynamic of it in something like Standard, but I still think this is a really good card, and I also think Commander decks are going to want to play this as well, especially if you're in an Aristocrat style deck. You know, this thing can get a bunch of your stuff killed if you want. It can also just be a payoff, and so I think this is going to be one of those board wipes that you're going to see a lot, and it's going for $16 to show for that. Next, we have Moonvale Regent. It is 3 and a red for a creature dragon 4/4 with flying, and it says whenever you cast a spell, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw a card for each of that spell's colors. When it dies, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. All right. First off, that first ability, this card goes in a Reinn deck. Reinn says whenever you discard a card, draw, or discard any number of cards, draw that many cards. Essentially, this deck wants to go in multicolor decks and Reinn. Reinn to discard a bunch of cards, multicolor decks, because if you cast a 5-drop and have less than 5 cards in your hand, you're essentially gaining value from it. Otherwise, it's fine. But then whenever it dies, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control, so that can deal up to 5 damage. It's pretty good. You know, the fact that every time you're casting a spell, you can almost cycle your hand means this will be good in combo style decks. Anything that wants stuff in the graveyard is going to like this. And it is all I may. You know, it's not like one of those cards where when you play it, you're now being forced to kind of like cycle your hand or play this little mini game of casting random spells or whatever. It's just a may. It's like, oh, I'm running low on cards. Fine, I'll discard my hand and draw 2 or 3 or 4. You know, so I think that's going to be really, really cool. It almost feels commander-y. Like it almost should be legendary, but it's not. And I'm very thankful for that. But it seems good, I think, in both 1v1 formats, as well as in Commander in those certain decks. Next, we have Teferi, who slows the sunset, going for $22. He's a 4-drop white-blue legendary planeswalker Teferi for loyalty. And it says you can +1 to choose up to 1 target artifact, up to 1 target creature, and up to 1 target land. Untap the chosen permanents you control and tap the permanents you don't. You gain 2 life. So this can tap down your opponent's stuff, which, by the way, it doesn't tap them and they don't untap. So if you're tapping stuff, it better impact them before their upkeep. Otherwise, you're just wasting abilities. Otherwise, in something like Commander, which I know I keep going to, this probably untaps a mana rock and a land, which then pays for 2 of the cost of Teferi. And if one of them was a Soul Ring, you actually pay for 3 of the mana you spent to cast Teferi. And then maybe you tap one of your opponent's things, or, you know, tap something else. But yeah, tapping artifact, creature, land, it's possible that you used all 3 to generate mana. And if that's the case, this +1 ramps you a ton. So, like, I think it'll be interesting to see. I think depending on the deck, this is going to be really good. Like if you're running like a blue-white artifact deck, I could see maybe wanting to run this just for that +1 of being able to untap your stuff. And a lot of the time, Teferi is only going to end up really costing you 2 mana. And then you could -2 them and look at the top 3 cards of your library and put one of them in your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library. So if you can get the +1 off and the -2, you essentially replace the card and replace the mana. And then it's basically just free card advantage, which obviously does require him to stick around, and that's easier said than done. But I still think that's pretty good. And then -7, you get an emblem with untap all permanents you control during each opponent's untap step, and you draw a card during each opponent's draw step. So if you get this, essentially you take a bonus turn on each person's turn, except you don't get to cast sorceries. It's only instant speed stuff. We've seen in the past how just untapping your stuff at your end step can be devastating to a format. This is a little bit different. You can't stack these nearly as easily, and it's not like at the beginning of upkeep untap them. It's just you untap with your opponent. So I think it's fine, but it's an ultimate. I don't like to judge planeswalkers off of the ult, but if you get it off, you're doing pretty well, especially in Commander. Commander, you know, drawing 4 cards every time around the table and untapping 4 times, pretty crazy. But again, don't judge a planeswalker off its ultimate unless it's super easy to get. Next, we have Arlen the Pax Hope, who's at $25. It's 2 red and a green for legendary planeswalker Arlen for loyalty with Daybound. You can +1, and until your next turn, you may cast creature spells as though they had flash, and each creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially, you can flash in stuff. It's actually a really good ability to have on a planeswalker. And then the bottom ability, -3, create 2 2/2 green wolf creature tokens. This seems really good to me, and here's the reason why. If you can +1 her and have mana open, then your opponents can attack Arlen, but you could flash something in, and it could be anything in your hand. And if you don't have that, you can -3 and create 2 wolves that then protect Arlen. And so both of them are protective based abilities, meaning I think Arlen's going to be pretty hard to hit. And then Arlen can swap over and be Arlen the Moon's Fury, and it's a legendary Planeswalker Arlen for loyalty. It'll keep the loyalty it already had. But then you +2 and add 2 mana, which is way less defensive, and then 0 until end of turn, it becomes a 5/5 werewolf creature with trample, indestructible, and haste. So we're actually seeing Arlen become a creature, which is something I think we've only seen Sarkhan and Gideon do, to my knowledge, at this point, in game at least. So this side is way less defensive. So if she's entering during the night, she's more on the attack, and if she's entering during the day, it's very defensive based, and I think that's really awesome to see. But I think this is one of those planeswalkers where you might actually, or one of those daybound or nightbound cards where the front may actually be better. Of course, you know, if we look at the spell, it costs 4, and you can +2 to remove loyalty, or sorry, to get 2 of that mana back. So I'm not saying it's bad to play it on the back by any stretch of the imagination. I just kind of find that interesting. That the front has some really different abilities. So typically with daybound, nightbound cards, the front and the back have very similar abilities, but the back is just better. But this is one where they're just different. And the last one is Reinn 7. It is 3 green for legendary planeswalker Reinn, 5 loyalty, +1. Reveal the top 4 cards of your library. Put all land cards revealed this way into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So you could be drawing 4 cards with this ability. You could be drawing none, but then you're still putting them into your graveyard, which is already good. 0, you put any number of land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So if you do manage to draw 4, the next turn you can just throw them all on the battlefield. -3, create a green treefolk creature token with reach, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. So you're going to get a pretty beefy thing. I'm assuming you have at least 5 mana, so he's creating a blocker. And then -8, return all permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. You get an emblem with you have no max hand size. Honestly, every ability on this just seems good. You're either generating card advantage, generating mana advantage, or generating creature advantage, all of which are good. And so you can do all of that really right as he enters the battlefield. And then if you manage to get up to his ult, all those cards that you've been dumping into your graveyard with the +1 are going to then go back to your hand as if they were there the whole time. So that's going to be pretty awesome. I do think this is one of those cards that will fall in price. Typically, Planeswalkers are priced high because it's really hard to judge how well they'll do without their supporting deck. And you'll notice that's why the top 3 were actually all Planeswalkers. And we're actually going to look at kind of a list of the cards. The top 3 were all Planeswalkers. And I think typically Planeswalkers get valued a little bit higher and then they drop a lot more just because, you know, they don't know how it's going to affect the metagame. It's a lot harder to tell. Either way, this is a comparison of Innistrad Midnight Hunt to D&D Forgotten Realms. Looking at the prices, D&D technically had the higher priced card, but you'll notice between Reinn 6 and Arlen, those are actually, you know, Arlen is $5 higher, whereas Tiamat is $5 higher than Reinn. So essentially those two cancel out. And then Teferi is more expensive than Imrith, sorry. And then going down the list, it has a little bit of a steep drop. So they are actually very similar in pricing. I think D&D was technically slightly higher value just because of that $4 jump from Moonvale Regent to Meathook Massacre, but generally they're going to be fine. I do worry a little bit that so much of the value of Innistrad Midnight Hunt lies in the Planeswalkers, because again, typically those fall pretty hard once they realize that there's not really a deck for it. But if there is a deck for one of them, then that price can also just go up. So it is a little bit more of a wild card there, but I think that it's looking fine for a Magic set. Typically, most of the value is going to come from the actual collector boosters, not actually cards, which is kind of just what Magic has moved towards. And so as long as you're aware of that, that's fine. Next, let's talk about the lands. All of the lands are $6, all 5 of them, in terms of the dual lands, and that's awesome. Having expensive lands is not great, and I would expect these to fall even further. And then we have the, what I will call rares to look out for. Outside of anything on the top 10, or this includes things in the top 10. These are all of the rares that are $4 and up. or sorry, above $4. Something that's $3.99 did not make the list. So you'll notice getting a rare does not typically pay for the price of a pack. And so that's just something to keep in mind if you're trying to open these for value. And then the uncommon, the most expensive uncommon, I should say, is Infernal Grasp. It's going for $2, which is not bad, but this is just a really good uncommon kill spell that I think a lot of decks are going to be playing. And so I would expect it to fall a little bit, but also it's just really good. All right, so what did you guys think about Innistrad Midnight Hunt? I would have loved to have covered spoilers a little bit more, but again, my life has been kind of crazy, and I'm going to try to get back into the swing of things here. Doing this video is my first kind of step back towards normalcy. Let me know what you guys think about all this in the comments down below. What cards are you excited to play with Midnight Hunt? And be ready for more of my content coming out soon regarding this awesome new set. See you in the next one. Bye.